it actually was around Chinese migration. And I learned a lot about this this whole thing, and through this whole past year, I did a lot of research, read a lot of books, and then this happened, and then a lot of these this history started repeating itself, and I started seeing the relevancy, and it kind of hit in a weird way, because I didn't expect to feel so strongly about some of these topics, you know, because I've been sort of working in this realm for so long, and then when this all came to a head, I felt like it was just much more relevant and more poignant. So I do appreciate the current discourse and what people are talking about these days with the anti-Asian racism and things like that in relation to coronavirus. And I think I'm gonna have to retool some of the ideas that I had based on that. But in any case, as I mentioned, my technique is really, I kind of try to do use different techniques in my work. So my first real, I don't consider myself an identity artist because I feel like, I mean, everybody is an identity artist in some way, because we're all expressing our own ideas and our own narratives, and that just feels true to me. One of my first pieces was all in oil, and it was a Asian bride. And that was about 10 years ago. That was my first piece. I think I put that up in one of the slides, but most of you know that work. And it's one that really kind of solidified this journey for me. It was kind of the first piece that really kind of gave me the voice to basically be like, you know what? I know that I don't want to be relegated to this subservient Asian wife kind of narrative. And so that's when I actually called off a wedding and decided to go down this path of doing art. And since then, I've been doing a lot of pieces that relate to understanding the Chinese migration history, and then using techniques that are personal to me, that I grew up doing in Chinese calligraphy, and kind of meshing that with certain materials like fresco and Venetian plaster. And so, let's see. The piece here, up here, is actually called The Waggle Dance. And I think some people know this work. The original pieces are in Denver, and they're about 6 feet. It's all done in burnished plaster. And here, let me actually walk up, because I think you can see it if I. It's all done in burnished plaster, and so the originals are bigger, and they actually have more dimension. It's called the waggle dance because this is what the bees do when they find opportunity. And for me, the bee is a good symbolism of the immigration story, because it is sort of this idea that they're migrating to a place of opportunity, and then they sort of bring in their community, and then somehow they're kind of relegated to the periphery, and they're not quite as valued as the work that they do. And so we're starting to kind of seeing that right now, you know, in some of the policies that we're seeing in our political discourse right now. Another one that I did was one called Hawaii, which is a Mobius strip that kind of came as a wave. And that Hawaii actually means overseas. So that's what we call overseas Chinese people. And essentially I was using the Mobius strip as a point of inspiration. And Mobius strip is kind of a figure 8. So when you go from one side and you draw a line, it goes all the way to the inside. So you're kind of on both sides at once. And I think that is a good symbolism for where the Asian American diaspora is in this conversation around race. And so I've always kind of felt that way about even my own experience in the US, because I came to America when I was 3. And so I've kind of always been sort of this half immigrant, you know, and I'd never really quite been on one side or the other. You know, people, they don't think that they think I'm born here or they think I'm born there. And I just don't quite fit into this like either or, right? So I've sort of been able to sort of, I think I've been able to be objective about what I see. And so a lot of my work sort of talks to that. Any questions so far? Okay. The next piece is, oh, sorry.
I just want to welcome everyone, and thanks for just like going ahead and starting, Sydney. Yeah, please feel free to ask question. I guess if you don't mind, Cindy.
No, please. I hate just talking like this. It's very strange, but but I will talk, and I will keep talking if you don't interrupt me. So please interrupt me. The piece, this is actually a piece that is also a print of a piece that I have that's in a collector's home in Utah. And it's called The Promised Land. And essentially what it is I had a solo show in Denver, and it was marking the 100th anniversary of the Transatlantic Railroad. And so this one was sort of the culminating piece, and it shows, you know, the perspective of us in the East Bay looking west to San Francisco. So there's the bridge. And if you look closely, there's going to be little, there's just little fragments and glimpses of the work that the immigrants have done in sort of uplifting our nation and what we've been able to do as a country. So, I mean, from afar, it looks like some beautiful landscape, but when you look closely, there's actually, you know, there's little remnants of I guess the bees, you know, that have done the work and sort of are relegated to the peripheries of history. So, you know, my job and what I like to do is sort of amplify those stories. And so in the grant that I've been doing for San Francisco Art Commission, I really kind of started doing a lot of research into, well, first the migration stories around different racial groups and ethnic groups, right? So I was looking at, you know, the African-American diaspora and the Japanese-American diaspora, and it just became a little too broad. And also I felt like I couldn't really speak to that personally. And so I really kind of focused in on the Chinese-American diaspora and the Chinese-American migration, because we have such a huge history and a rich history here in San Francisco. And I also feel like in a lot of ways, because my parents came, you know, after the Heller-Celler Act in 1965, they were able to come in the 80s, and they were able to do a lot of things that they were able to do without really recognizing a lot of the historical roots that were established before we were here. So I wanted to make a conscious decision to really learn that. And I just uncovered a lot of things that are really kind of striking in our current discourse that just really echoes some of the things that we saw in the past. So the series that I kind of came up with is called Abridged. And I started looking into, of course, you know, looking at the historical timeline of the Chinese migration. There were always, you know, there was a lot of trauma, right? There's a lot of like, with the Chinese railroads and, you know, the railroad workers and a lot of the, you know, picture brides and a lot of this stuff. I wanted to show just without actually, I wanted to challenge myself to not use any kind of symbolism or any kind of words or symbolism to show what I was getting at. So this is sort of just a test to see the sort of rawness and things that we're using materials that I've been already using to kind of talk about that pain and that scarification that comes through sort of being cut off from your culture and then having to rebuild or assimilate. And then this one as well is a little test piece that sort of talks about, it sort of talks about the scarification that, you know, I was talking about, but also the lines, railroads, things like that. Thank you, Ariel. Yeah, you know, it's, I think that there is so much communication in the technique and the materials you use, because you can kind of, I don't ever want to limit myself to a certain technique or material, because I think that it speaks so much to the message. And so I'm really trying to utilize every technique and every material to its fullest extent. And so in that, you know, I wanted to express some of this abstractly, but also the fragmentation of a cultural experience. So, for example, during the Japanese incarceration, I looked, you know, that stuff, I started doing things like this, where I would cast certain pieces and break them, put in different motifs, and then glue them back together. So little things like the barbed wires in the back and the kintsugi, that was sort of the way that I wanted to express how I see, you know, some of these stories in the Japanese incarceration camps. Margaret, where did you source these materials? Everywhere. You know, I started doing stuff like this too with building materials. I felt like, to me, the juxtaposition of natural versus man-made materials. So this is a brick. This is a brick, and I felt like it's really kind of, a brick says a lot about a place, right? And I think it's loaded with symbolism in its foundation, building blocks, gentrification. You know, when you really kind of look at a material, if you look at a brick, if you look at a rock, if you look at a tree, these are all things that tell stories, right? So when I'm using things like, behind me is this large pecan tree slab and a redwood slab. And right down here is a Japanese, Japanese walnut. And that was my rendition of that immigration story, you know, coming to a new place. And as you can see, that's a wave. So, you know, really utilizing these materials, and I guess I don't really know where I source the materials. I think I just sort of look around me and see where I can find stories. I mean, I have a lot of rocks from random places. And in this one, for example, this was Francis Tuck. So this is the brick. I broke it and put in the portraits of the stories that I was able to find in, for example, in the Berkeley Oral History Archives. So Berkeley Oral History Archives is like a treasure trove of just these stories of ordinary immigrants and folks that had lived through the World Wars, certain times in history. And I was able to find, because I'm not really interested in like the famous people, you know? I really want to find the stories of just ordinary folks that sort of paved the way for where we are now. And so those are the building blocks, you know, those are the people who are paving the way and really telling those stories. And I want to honor that. So Frances Tuck, her dad came in Angel Island. Her mom was a picture bride. She lived through World War II. She lived in the East Bay, and her family owned a dollar store. And during the Japanese incarceration, she wore a button. So she'd talk about going across the Bay Bridge with her family, coming to San Francisco, and having to wear a button that that showed that she wasn't Japanese. So she would say, I am Chinese American, and therefore they could go through the bridge and they wouldn't be harassed. Now I saw T-shirts just recently after the coronavirus that said, I am not Chinese. And so these are the kinds of things that kind of you know, if you know history, it kind of freaks you out because there is this idea that opportunities are given to certain groups, and we have to differentiate ourselves as minorities in order to stay safe and survive. And so I started digging into other histories around, let's see. I started going into more stuff around just the history of policies. And of course, I came across redlining HOLC maps, which are housing maps that came, that basically, you know, we would deny housing to certain groups. And so I started doing things around that. So this piece is actually kind of inspired by that. These are red line maps, and this kind of comes together, actually, wrong way. It kind of come together like this. And I used that same idea of breaking pieces, casting pieces, re-breaking them, and then putting them back together to signify coming from one place as a whole, breaking into things, and then, or breaking up, and then, you know, there's fingerprints on there. The path and the movement is sort of documented with the Sumi ink and sort of moving over the movement. And I came across this historian and professor at Berkeley, Michael Laguerre. He's an African-American professor, and he talks about something called I can't even pronounce it because it's written and I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's Panethnoopolis, and it's essentially what it is. The definition is it is a global neighborhood that's characterized by the circulation of people, goods, knowledge, and images across transnational networks of sites, which is a part. So Richmond being Richmond district, San Francisco, being a Pantheopolis of Chinatown, and Chinatown being one of places in China or places in Hong Kong. And I think the relevancy of those places are defined by kinfolk networks. So the immigrant kinship networks are actually not reproduced automatically. They are a product of physical conditions receiving government immigration policies that are favorable to immigration, market opportunities, so, you know, ability to establish housing or business, and also just being able to help each other out in establishing their footprint in a new country. So, in a new country, in a new city. And so all the places that we know of that are ethnic enclaves are actually, they were allowed based on policies that were favorable at the time. And so I wanted to kind of show that and also talk about how fragile, you know, these things are, because they are just, it is generations of breaking and creating. And also those scars are still there, you know, those trails are still there. And they form the next generation of experiences. Question from Aaron. Duality of the brick shard in the portrait is very compelling. Oh yeah, I do, I write. This is actually, I write first in most of my work. That's sort of how I start each piece. And so, yeah, I do. I just don't publish it because I'm hoping that this actually, I can get it to speak for itself. But I do think that especially in my grant that I did, I felt like I read so many books and I didn't actually get to make the pieces that I felt corresponded to all the research that I did. So I was nerding out most of the time, and then the coronavirus hit and I wasn't able to finish all of it. But if I go around the room real quick, those are pieces right now, but this is one that I started, and it really comes down to, so I use the redwood, this redwood, this large piece of redwood here, and I traced the grains. I traced the grain pattern from it. Oh, crap. And came up with this landscape. So this is actually from the redwood. And the redwood tree is interesting. I did a lot of research into the native redwood trees, and they actually are on both coasts. So redwood trees show up in Taiwan, China, and in the West Coast. So probably Pangea, I don't know. But the grain patterns are a migratory landscape. And so I started carving into it as a way to disrupt the flow of the migration. And I'm not sure where I'm going to go next, but this is another one. And that one is the pecan. And the pecan shows up in places all over the world, but mainly in Africa, Mexico, and in the South in the US. So the idea is that I'm going to use, my next work is to really utilize these slabs and these types of trees to symbolize the work that I'm going to be doing. So this is sycamore, and that is cypress. Yeah, any questions?
So I have a question. So do you paint directly on the wood? So you work the wood out and you paint on the wood?
No, I for this one, for the one down here, I sand and gesso and plaster a little bit, but it is, you know, many layers of priming.
Oh yeah, because yeah, I read that you use fresco and
yes.
Chinese painting techniques for your paintings.
Yeah, I do sometimes work directly on wood. It just depends on the piece, but for the most part, I will do things like carve into it, prime it. I do, I coat it with resin sometimes. And then here's another piece. These are two pieces that I did around just the idea of, read this book, wonderful, I highly recommend it. It's by Anne Anlin Chang, who is a scholar here in Berkeley as well. And she talks about the melancholy of race. She wrote a book called Melancholy of Race, and she kind of, and this is the first book I've ever read that really kind of talks about the Asian American concept of race. And she kind of looks at it through the lens of literature, history, psychology, even philosophy and film. And what I find interesting is she kind of labels the immigrant experience, or and this is not just the Asian immigrant experience, but all immigrant experiences, as the first step being assimilation. So let me make sure that I say this right, but assimilation, where the culture becomes static and preserved. So you're sort of asked to shed that culture, but to assimilate to a certain place. And then the next step is to re-ethnicize. So we see a lot of things, and I see this in my work too, is trying to figure out and construct our own versions of what we know of the culture. So I see this in different generations past the immigrant, one that comes, the first generation, second generations, they start to look at the history, and then they sort of try to preserve this heritage that maybe we don't have a very big connection to anymore. And there is a certain void that I think is that we have to accept, because we're not necessarily connected to that heritage, but we are making our own. And I think that's really important to distinguish, is really understanding how we fit into that landscape and that narrative. And so these are all pretty lofty concepts to try to distill into a certain visual, but I think that I just have to do a lot of it in order to kind of encapsulate some of these different facets of the ideas. Orientalism. You know what? I've heard of that one. I have not. And do you recommend it?
I just finished the first chapter, but it really starts out locating how yellow women's subjectivity is both like a cipher and also one that's encrusted. That's a subjectivity that's been formulated within the US as like a subaltern subjectivity alongside Black femininity.
Okay. Your stuff is dense. And I'm so glad that you are reading it too, because it's hard to get through. And I love to talk to you more about it because.
The writing is dense, yeah. But when you were talking about your process, I wanted to ask you, how does melancholy inform your work? Because when you talk about your experiences, your experiences trying to capture the diaspora and feeling sort of the sense of exile that's really different from actually being literally exiled. It sounded like racial melancholia. So
absolutely.
Anyway, we can, I haven't finished it, but I really like the book, so.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. I want to hear more about what you think too, because obviously you're an artist and you've been kind of digesting this as well. I would love to, it's such a rich topic, and I think it's one that even in my political activism, and I'm starting to realize that it's a very different experience than any other racial dynamic here in the US. And it's just something that we don't talk about for one reason or another. To answer your question regarding melancholy in my work, I think that is actually a really big part of it. And it wasn't until I read the book that I really understood that. Is sort of grasping at a something that's past that we can't get back, if that makes sense.
One last thing about ornamentalism, the book itself traces how our current modern day legal proceedings, things like passport photos, things like presenting evidence and witness testimony, can actually be traced back to the attempt to like criminalize foreign bodies with the arrival of the Chinese in the 1800s. So the book actually covers situates itself in that historical grounding, and it starts in San Francisco. So it's really interesting.
I mean, that's the thing, is we're so lucky to have all these resources. I mean, I was going to go down to, I did go down to Angel Island, and it's just I'm really grateful for academics and people who actually document this stuff. So this is actually a really good time, because we are documenting all these things by having these Zoom conversations. As much as, we don't love doing this, I think it's definitely a way to record these conversations that maybe somebody like me will go and find later on and really see a lot of value in. And it's just, I do think, for example, like what you said, a lot of what we're able to find and the remnants of history that we're able to get to are not from us, and not from the people who they're talking about, right? So a lot of the historical remnants and the relics that you see are actually around trauma and pain. So this is actually the relic series that I wanted to sort of highlight was, the fragments that you see are actually kind of curated in a way to tell a certain story as well. And we're kind of seeing that, play out in different ways even now. For example, I'm working with a group right now that is trying to get out the Asian American vote. And in the political sphere, they consider the Asian Americans as too hard to reach, you know, not worth it. And maybe not big enough of a voice to actually warrant any sort of outreach. And so I do see that there is potential here to shift, but I also think we also, as people that have come to this country and adopted the policies and all the history around it, we do have to understand all the people that came before and how we got here, and really understanding the history.
Hey, Cindy, could I ask a question?
Of course.
Hi.
Good to see you.
I think it's been 15 years. That's
It's
how
long. Where are you?
Oh my gosh, you guys, it's so nice to see all your beautiful faces because I'm in Southern Indiana, and I was most recently, well, this is so I'll ask my question and then I'll share a little bit about like where the question comes from. So I love that your work is so informed by history, and you know, I think really it's also there's this there's this element of place that also, it sounds like, shapes your work, because where I'm living, it's predominantly Caucasian Americans, white or Black. And I was just thinking at a workplace meeting, every face that I saw on the Zoom screen the other day of 15 of us were completely white except for mine. So I was just wondering how maybe you being in San Francisco and being in California, where there is an Asian American community and where there's so much history and where you can just pull from different resources, but also just walk on the streets, you know, of this history, how that has shaped your vision and your art in general.
And can you tell us more about where that question comes from? Because I know you studied this for a long time.
Oh, well, I'm just living, you know, I was in California for a little bit, for almost a decade, and then I moved back to my hometown, which is Southern Indiana, and there was culture shock when I moved out to California because there was so much diversity. I mean, not just in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, but also in terms of class and just ideologies. But now moving back, it's mostly conservative and very white for the field of work that I'm in. I work at a university, not teaching, but helping low-income first generations navigate university life. And it's just, I just wonder, I'm just thinking through of what this means for me personally as a Chinese American woman, you know, living in a place that doesn't reflect me, where people don't understand. I went to take my mom to do lab work because she doesn't speak English, and she, you know, they moved the clinic so she can't get to the new clinic because she doesn't read, so she can't navigate. And I think most people are like, that's kind of strange. Why would you have to do that?
Yeah, I don't understand why we have to do that. Yeah. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of the unique experience that we have. I think that we need to amplify and celebrate, because it is a uniquely Asian American experience. Maybe not necessarily just Asian American, but an immigrant and children of immigrant experience. And well, thank you for that. You know, I have been so lucky to have landed in California and in LA, and then coming here even to San Francisco 15 years ago. It has really drastically changed my work and how I feel about the Asian American diaspora. First of all, San Francisco probably is the oldest, you know, from the 1800s when the railroad workers came, they came to San Francisco. And then throughout, we've actually had more waves of migration to San Francisco. And in LA, I didn't see that. So in LA, I would say a lot of the Asian immigrants they came after the Hatch Act, so 70s and 80s, right? There are different group of people who, you know, usually came either educated or employed. through companies, or they're able to actually create companies. I read something like 9 out of 11, I think until the 80s, it was like the majority of Chinese immigrants were business owners. And that was because they were allowed by the government policies. And that was probably predominantly in the coast, right? New York and San Francisco and in LA. So my experience has always been, my high school was 60% Asian. I mean, we had a ton of students. It was LA public school, so 2,800 people in my high school, and it was like 50 to 60. No, I lied. It's like maybe 40% Asian. Pretty diverse, but that has always been part of my experience. And yet, when I came to San Francisco, it was the first time I met generations before me that were Asian American. So before that, everybody I knew that was from from an older generation spoke with an accent, or they didn't speak English. And they were kind of relegated to these pockets like Monterey Park, San Gabriel Valley, Rolling Heights. If you're familiar with LA, like these are the ethnic enclaves of the LA suburbs. And so when I came here, everyone was kind of it was more diverse in the cities, and I was able to come across these generations of Asian Americans, like people on here, Rico, and Lenore, Sandy, who have really shown me that there has been this activism, and we're strongly rooted in activism in changing their narrative here in San Francisco. Now, finding that community like the Asian American Women's Artists Association, they don't have that anywhere else. They don't have the Asian American Women's Artists Association. We are like such a minute group of like, I mean, how many Asian American artists do you know? And then how many of them are women? And how many of them are fine artists? Not many. In San Francisco, we have a group that actually like champions some of this and really tries to raise up the voices of Ruth Asawa, Bernice Bing, Asian American artists from the past that haven't gotten the acclaim and haven't gotten some of the attention that some of these other artists have gotten, that weren't Asian American. So I guess to answer your question, I can't say I know how that feels to not be in a place where my husband's from Denver and he's mixed race. And so he tells me a lot about growing up in a place where he does not feel like he is represented or understood. I am lucky enough to have found these resources and people that have guided me and really allowed me to see that there's a lot more work to be done. But I think that is a responsibility from people like us who live in a place that to actually make it safer for the Asian American diaspora to live elsewhere and really be able to speak their mind and share their voice.
I actually have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk about all of these subject matters that are very important, and you have done a lot of research. And I'm going to go back to Aaron's question that, do you ever include written narratives? Because how do you feel like if somebody sees, like especially the more abstracted work, how do you feel like if they just see it, oh, this is just form and there's not much behind it, while in reality you've done so much research and so much thought has gone into the process?
It doesn't matter to me, honestly. It doesn't. I think the pieces that I create are all part of the same thought process, and I actually appreciate different perspectives that come into it because I can only speak for my experience. I can't speak for others, but for other people, they might really relate to it in a different way. You know, people have seen my landscapes and said, hey, that reminds me of the East Coast where I grew up, and you know, sort of my memories around that. And there are immigrants that obviously have the same experience that I don't know anything about. So this is an opening to a conversation that I'd like to have. And I think that that is where, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I think this is where art really is becoming, is a powerful tool to have those conversations. I mean, Bruce has like some of my pieces, and he's told me a lot of how he's related to it. And, you know, it's been just awesome to be able to get to know him and get to know the kind of relation and the stories that he gets from my work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I really enjoyed your work. It's very beautiful. I have two questions actually. One is that so you like use a lot of pieces of wood. So what are the histories of like behind those material that you use? Like, are they found objects, or you just like purchase them? So that's one question. And the other question is that I'm really interested to learn more about the research part that you do. So I was thinking, like, in your research with like different ethnic groups, can you expand more on the like details of the research? Like, if you do like the immigration aspect, like what are the details of the research, or like do you focus on a specific generation? And did you find like any similarities or something like unique stand, like personal, that you found it like between different ethnic groups?
Ooh, yes, that was actually, let me start with the second question, because that is actually what I wanted to focus on when I first started the grant, right? Was to say, okay, so we've had all these waves of immigration to San Francisco. What are the similarities and what are the differences, right? What are some of the patterns we're seeing? So I focused on ordinary people. And this goes back to Melissa's comment that when you try to go back, you can't always find ordinary people. It's always people, you know, oh, the first nightclub owner or the first, you know, lawyer or something. So I dug around for that and found people like, so, gosh, I have all these books. I'll have to send it to you. But let's see. Let me see this. Can find the books, but I found this Jewish lawyer that came back in the civil rights time, that came from New Jersey, and he was fighting for civil rights for Black Americans here, and then there was so I would try to relate them to people I know who are maybe Jewish that came a little later, and then I wanted to see the intersectionality between why they came and what they were working on and how sort of maybe one informed the other. Now, this is what I'm saying, that it became too broad because I didn't feel comfortable doing art that didn't speak to my experience, because I didn't want to speak for them. I don't know what it's like to be Jewish American to come here. And so I focused on what I knew. That's not to say that I'm not going to branch out and actually start to, make those connections later on. But for now, I really want to focus on just what I know. Second question is the materials. I partnered with this group called Greenport Designs. Greenport Designs up in Novato, and they're in Sonoma, Novato. They're in Marin. They do found materials, so they're a woodworking company, and they usually get sourced woods from anywhere, old buildings, old gymnasiums, and they build things from it. And so I went and talked to them, and they were like total wood geeks. They knew everything about curing wood. They knew everything about each type of wood, how it works and everything. So I relied on them to kind of give me the rundown. So what I did is I went there, talked to them, told them my ideas. I said, okay, I want some woods that actually represent the Asian to American migration. And they were like, well, we have these like castaway wood we can't do anything with, you know. They have like, this redwood is so brittle and old that I can't do anything with it. So you can have it or you can buy it off of me. So I started taking some of these scrap materials and doing stuff with it. Like, for example, the one that I showed you, but also let me, hold on one second. So this is like a weird piece that they can't do anything with. And this is like 100 years old. This thing is like, and I started putting bees on it and filling it. And this was just really for fun, you know. I didn't really want to do anything with it, but I just, in holding the materials and finding them and also partnering with somebody who was like just such a wood nerd, I think we were just bouncing ideas off each other. We're like, okay, so like this would be this person, right? So like the pecan might be like the African-American guy from the South who comes fighting for, marched in the civil rights movement and now is a professor at CCSF or at San Jose State. And the cypress is this person. So really, I use nature in my work a lot just to symbolize these kinds of things, like the materials, like I said, but also just nature, because I think immigration itself is such a natural force, you know, it ebbs and flows. And then I think in a way it gets pulled up, like they pull people in and then kind of push them out in this really kind of natural forces, you know, whether that's in a turbulent way or a natural way. But that's why the trees are really important. And that's also a technique in Chinese painting, a literati painting, where, you know, trees symbolize certain things. So even in this piece right here with the waggle dance, the trees that I used are specific to areas. So east and west, I had Chinese elm, and then I had a Monterey cypress. So if I'll try to show you real quick, but if you could see, those are trees that symbolize things. So in that tradition, there's a lot more to it in terms of the placement, the colors, whether you put something on the east side or the west side or the north side. And then
I think like for me, when I see your work, I think wood is really powerful material that you use, specifically if it is like piece of like one day tree, you know, because I can see like tree has a root in the ground, and like when I'm thinking about immigration, like someone root like has some root, then like they move somewhere else and they try to like create that root again like somewhere else, you know, that transition. And also I was thinking about, you know, when you see like for example like the vast fire somewhere, that you see like trees that it took like hundreds of years to be that tree and now it's burned. And I'm thinking like there is so much that you can think about, like even use like part of the trees that are already burned, you know, and like how many years it takes to again like build what it was before, you know. I think conceptually it's really connected to what you're trying to say, you know. This is what I see.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that perspective.
Thank you.
Is there another comment? I do, and thank you for that, because it took a while to get to that point where I was like, okay, this is it. Like, I want to use this material to represent this. And the idea of this castration or truncation, I call the series Abridged because it's abridged. It's a story that gets cut, you know, and in some ways, a lot of the racial melancholy, like with what Melissa was mentioning, is yearning for something that doesn't exist anymore. And she talks about this in an example where it's a story about, there's an anecdote about these sailors who had somebody get their leg amputated because of some bacteria, you know, maybe gangrene. And the whole time they start to kind of obsess over this limb that's missing. You know, they start kind of, they just obsess over it. They write stories about it. They draw pictures of it. They celebrate it. They put together like some kind of worship with it. And I just find that really fascinating, you know, because there is this idea in the US where we are trying to preserve something that maybe doesn't exist anymore. Like, none of what Chinatown represents is, when I went to China, that's not what it looks like anymore. You know what I mean? It's not, even the food that is really popular in Chinatown and the food that we have as American cuisine or Chinese American cuisine is not Chinese cuisine, you know? And so it's really, I think it's really fascinating where, and it's not all bad either. And this is what I want to reiterate too. I don't think it's all bad, because I think that in that truncation, in that castration, if you want to call it that, there is this democratization and ability to be objective. For example, I have a conversation with a bunch of Asian American activists every month, and they span generations. Lenore is in it. And what's fascinating is that we all kind of, our story came when we got to the US, or we were born here, and it gave us an ability to relate to certain other groups. For example, as Chinese immigrants, we were taught to be mistrusting of Japanese immigrants, right? Because of the war and a lot of these things that happened in the past. Being in the US has given us an opportunity to not have to worry about any of that stuff. Not that we don't have to worry about it, but that baggage doesn't exist, or we can overcome it. And so I think what's interesting is now we're considered all Asian American, and we're all part of this history that came from the 1800s. And we're trying to construct what that means, you know, and that's in aggregate, you know, and the conversation now is around people of color, right? So people of color, like, now it's like, okay, so now what does that mean? What does that mean? The Asian American diaspora is so huge. I don't even know the Southeast Asian diaspora history, and I want to, but we are now lumped in this group together as a part of Asian American history, you know, and American history. And I think the easy way is to say, well, I'm not Japanese, or I'm not Indian, or I'm not, you know, to sort of differentiate yourself, but we have to acknowledge the part that we play in American history. And I think that comes with some responsibilities. All right, question, Ariel. Berlin Wall, yes, I studied German history. I love Germany, went to Germany. I lived in Berlin, and love everything about, well, what's scary is that learning about Weimar history, it's a little too similar to what we're seeing right now. Work is still those raw areas. Geez, okay. So curing wood takes about a year. Now, I have that Greenport design people to actually cure it for me, so I don't have to worry about it. That's what makes it stabilized. Otherwise, it expands and it does things with oxygen. So that's why my work can be stable, is because it's already cured. Otherwise, it would just fall apart. Like, I can't go and cut off a tree right now and paint on it. It'd just fall apart. A lot of, like, this one is epoxy resin. So this one's finished that way. It's funny because every piece acts so differently. Like, I started pouring the acrylic in there, and I put like probably a whole bottle in there because it's probably empty in here, and it's all just filled with acrylic now. So everything is like a little bit different, but I seal it with either acrylic or epoxy or some kind of pouring medium. That's usually pretty stable. Bruce. Thank you. Yeah, it is interesting because I sometimes people are worried about people not seeing everything that you want to convey in a piece, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. I think the fact that people are even interested is already kind of shocking to me, to be honest, because I find it so fascinating, and I'm hoping that it provides a little bit of a window. It provides a window into wanting to learn more. And if that means that they look at it and they're like, that's pretty, I like it. And that kind of opens up the opportunity to learn more. That's exactly what I want. And that's what I'm hoping for.
Hey, I want to ask another question, just going back to some of the techniques that you use. You talk about using Italian fresco and then Chinese brush painting. And I was wondering if that's also something that relates to the concept that you were talking about, like immigration and race. And yeah, I'm just really curious about those processes. And another question. Sorry. And another question that I have is, I'm curious about the areas that I guess that are just plaster, and especially in some of the landscape paintings, that you have areas that a lot of plaster is showing and it's not covered. And I'm really interested in the contrast between the very detailed landscape versus like the large parts that are showing all the layers from underneath. I think that in that area it works out really well, but I wanted to talk a little about it.
Okay, those are really good questions. Thank you. First one is the idea of the Italian fresco versus the sumi ink, and I came across some articles around some research around some of the things that occurred through history. So in the Shang dynasty, they found a lot of objects that look like things from the Shang dynasty, which is the first dynasty, 1500s down in Peru. And then I found out that the terracotta warriors in China they were hiring people artisans from Greece that were showing them, they were brought into China and showing them how to do the contrapposto pose. And there's just, and to me, like I've been reading about all these historical times where I think the sharing of art and ideas have always been, it's just that now we look back, and I think the politics and the societal boundaries have cut off some of those narratives, and now we kind of see things as very distinct. Like this is the Chinese dynasties, this is the Peruvian dynasty, this is the Renaissance in Europe. And what I found out was the frescoes were actually done in the Renaissance, late 15th century. Sorry, the Shang dynasty is way early, like 800 BC. But the 15th dynasty is the literati period in Chinese history, which is the Song dynasty. So late Song dynasty is the literati period. And it was at the same time Marco Polo was also coming to China. And so there's actually a lot of cultural exchange happening. And there were frescoes in Italy, and also like in Eastern China and Southern China. And so I used those materials because I wanted to show that those things have always been, we've always been a cultural, art has always been we don't have boundaries in art. There's no boundaries in art. And it isn't until these political lines that we're drawing that we're seeing those conversations change. So that's why those things are together. And it's also a representation for me, the dichotomy between East and West. And it isn't a dichotomy, but I like showing that dichotomy just to create the conversation. And that goes into your second question, which is the exposed parts versus the kind of the inner parts. And that push and pull has always been really interesting to me, because I want to finish certain parts, and I want to create detail in certain parts. And the terrain itself, as the process, as an artist, is always more interesting because what it's a really labor intensive process, right? Like I put on one layer, I have to burnish it down with a plaster knife. Find my plaster knife. So these are Venetian plaster knives. And basically, I put it on with these, and then I also have to go in small circles and just rub it down and push it really hard so it actually burnishes it down in layers. So it kind of melds together. And then the process kind of informs some of the stories because it sort of like the plaster will fall anywhere, it'll crack, it'll, excuse me, do whatever it wants. So it'll actually create the terrain for me. And I always thought that it was really indicative of the immigrant experience because you kind of have this like plan. You put down your layers and then it kind of does its own thing. And then you have to work within whatever happens, you know, and you can't control it. You can't, it'll do what it wants to do. And it's also that labor intensive sort of layered by layer, brick by brick kind of monotony, I think that really gets to that meditation in my work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh,
So
I'm so happy. This is so cool.
I just have one comment. Thank you so much for your presentation and sharing your work, Cindy. I was just thinking, that's just a comment. It's interesting that some of your landscape, it's like remind me of Chinese painting landscapes and the delicate washes and the color and everything. But it's just interesting that how those paintings were created, like kind of based on the philosophy of Taoism and then after Zen. And like the base philosophy is just to empty yourself of thought and every distraction. And like, but you are carrying all this heavy conversation in your work. That's just interesting.
Well, thank you for noticing that. It's been really hard to do right now, to be honest. You know, I really had to stop and really consider where I wanted to go with it because it's not all beautiful and it's not all easy to do and have that. And I don't know, it is like a lot to really think about. I try to aspire to an egoless art, which I don't know what that means because a lot of art is ego. But I am Buddhist because I grew up Buddhist and my grandma raised me, so she's very Buddhist. So a lot of those kind of philosophies kind of creep into my work, and so I let that inform my work. I don't try to impose too much of my thoughts, but that's why I think it's so important for me to do the research and really understand where the historical roots come from, because I want to do the right thing and actually represent it correctly and honestly without putting too much of my own spin on things. And that's really kind of difficult to do right now.
It is difficult, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Since we're, oh, sorry, but do you have another?
No, I just want to thank everybody. And I've just been so, I'm just so blown away by the support that I've been able to get in this time. It's such a crazy time for all of us. And I just feel like I'm just even more appreciative of people who can understand and appreciate my work.